Good evening.
Good evening.
In contrast to this morning's lesson, we are looking at another woman in the Bible, but as you can guess from the Bible reading, it is not necessarily one that you would want to model your life after. So we're taking a look at Delilah tonight, but there's a little bit more to it than just that, because what we're doing is we're trying to address the subject that Delilah brings up, which again is probably obvious enough, but the issue that we see consistently with Delilah is lying, except more so than maybe some kinds of lying that we'll also think about. So when it comes to lying, as a way of introducing this topic, there may not be another sin with as broad of a spectrum as lying when it comes to the earthly consequences, especially of the lies. Because in some cases, a lie, the result of the lie, even if it's wrong to do so, the result can be the sparing of someone's feelings. Now, again, is that a worthy reason? We're not talking about that. But then on the other extreme, the result of a lie can be someone's death, or thousands of people's deaths, depending on the circumstances. And so lying can go from one extreme to the other. Now, the other thing that we're going to try to do, though, is that we're going to take a look at this, and this may end up being a little bit more technical than it should be, but we're going to introduce alongside the concept of lying, because I think we all have a basic grasp of lying and what the Bible says about it. But beyond that, we're going to look at what we can find out from a more of a counseling perspective, more of a psychological perspective, because Delilah's lying is not maybe the same as what we think of all the time when it comes to the lies that we tell in the world. And so what we're going to do is put this in a little bit more of a real world context for one, but it's also one that's unfortunately close to a lot of people. That is, that people deal in their lives with people that lie to them on a regular basis. Sometimes this is as distant as a coworker, sometimes it's a friend that you have that you just know that they're always going to be coming up with something that's not true, or it could be that it's a parent, it could be even an adult child, it could be a spouse, it could be anything. And yet, when this situation happens, when someone is a Delilah and when someone's a Samson, then a lot of problems will happen. So let's give a little bit of background as we get into this, and then we'll take a look at the text. But as far as background goes, first we want to define what we mean when we say lying, because there are different ways that people look at this. But lying is intentionally misrepresenting or intentionally giving a false statement about something. And again, the intentionality is necessary. Because I've heard people try to say that if you commit to doing something tomorrow and then for whatever reason you're not able to, that you've lied. Well, that is not the case. There was no intentionality of you not keeping your word. There's a whole different set of morals that apply to that situation, perhaps, but it's not the same as lying, which is an intentional deception that we're going to see here. Now, the other question in the way of this background is all lying the same? Well, in a way, yes, kind of like we can say all sin is the same, and yet we know sin is different, and lying is the same in the way that it can be different. Now, when it comes to some lying, like we said, it can have different earthly consequences, so that may be one way of distinguishing it. But also, lying sometimes is, at least in our minds, easier to rationalize, and sometimes impossible to rationalize. Now, that doesn't make it right or wrong. Don't misunderstand me. But let me give you the example. In this text that we're going to look at, both characters, Delilah and Samson, lie, don't they? Because every time that Delilah says, hey, tell me how you can be, how your strength can be taken from you. 3 times in a row, what does Samson do? He lies. He doesn't tell her the truth. He tells her something else. But in our minds, can't we rationalize that a lot easier than we can what Delilah's doing? And so, again, that doesn't justify it, but it does somehow make it different. And of course, God will judge all of that accordingly as he sees fit. But the other thing we want to say about Delilah is that she's not just lying, but she is a liar. And so what's the distinction there? Well, A liar is someone that lies all the time. In fact, that's how we're going to talk about it, because that's the example that we see from her. And we see this idea, this label of liar applied to Satan as well. That he's always been a liar since the beginning. But for Delilah, she is a liar. She has a habit of lying again and again. Now, like I said, we're going to bring in some things from a psychological background as well. And I think they'll be beneficial if we're willing to hear them out. There are different reasons that people lie. And there are different reasons that people end up being liars. And so the two primary ways that's broken down in psychology is into compulsive lying and pathological lying. Well, what's the difference between the two? This is going to oversimplify it, but compulsive lying is somebody who has made a habit of lying, and yet there's not necessarily an underlying reason behind it. And so that can happen for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes it's associated with different personality disorders and other conditions, but again, generally it's just where it becomes their go-to habit that they have formed for some reason, but it's really not otherwise specified. So compulsive lying can happen, but it doesn't necessarily have any malice behind it. There's no attempt at manipulation, it's just that's what they do, and there's not necessarily a reason that the person is lying. The other side of it is pathological lying. Now that name sounds pretty sinister, and it can be, but pathological lying just means that there is a pathology to the lying that's taking place, meaning there's a reason that it's happening. And that can be a lot of different things. It could be a couple of different examples here. It could be that it comes or stems from narcissism. I think that's probably something that people closely associate with pathological lying. But it could also be antisocial personality disorder. It could be any number of childhood traumas, or it could be a sort of coping mechanism that someone has developed. So, for example, if someone has grown up in a family where they're expected to be perfect or held to a very high standard, and they can't meet that standard, sometimes if that pressure is enough, then they'll develop a pathological lying as a result, trying to cover up for the inadequacies that they may have. But whatever the reason behind it is, it's usually very much manipulative. And so when we start to talk about someone who lies constantly and someone who is manipulative, that's where we get back to Delilah. Because everything that we get to see of her, which admittedly is not a life story, but what we see of her fits this mold exactly. And so let's take a look at Delilah. So we're in Judges chapter 16. Samson has already been recorded in a couple of chapters before this, but this introduces Delilah. And so chapter 16, and we will start with verse 4 here. It says, "Afterward it happened that he," that is Samson, "loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah." All right, well, that's all the introduction that we get. Let me say first off that sometimes we probably think of Samson and Delilah as husband and wife. It does not say that. So it may seem like that, and it's possible that they were, but the text doesn't tell us that. But they were romantically involved. And she is from the valley of Sorek, which would be near Philistia. She probably is a Philistine. She certainly has lots of ties to the Philistines, but I don't think it comes out and says that either. But this woman, it says that Samson, essentially he falls for Delilah. In verse 5, "The lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, 'Entice him and find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver.'" So she agrees. It would seem by the story, at least, that this happens pretty quickly. But as soon as they become involved, the lords of the Philistines come to her with an offer. And they say, "Hey, if we pay you enough money, will you, in turn, give us Samson?" And very specifically, they say, "so that we can afflict him." So it's worth pointing out there that this isn't Delilah being naive and thinking maybe no harm will come to this person that she loves. No, it's very much from the beginning, perfectly known to her, and she'll make that clear as well, that their intention is to cause him harm. And so she is going to agree to this, of course, and what does she get in exchange? She gets money. Now, if you do a little bit of math here, you have 1,100 pieces of silver. Depends on how much you think that amounts to at that time. There's different numbers that are given there. But these 1,100 pieces of silver come not from one person, but from the lords of the Philistines. Well, the lords of the Philistines are 5 in number. They're the 5 cities, Ashdod, Ashkelon, all 5 cities of the Philistines. And we see that back in Judges chapter 3, verse 3. That's how we get that number for 5. But anyway, if you do 5 times 1,100 pieces of silver, we'll ballpark this somewhere around $150,000. Now, today, that's a fair amount. But remember, at this time, it's not like today. You're not paying insurance. You're not paying to keep your electric and your water running. So that's going to end up being pretty valuable, maybe even more so than now. So why does she do this? Well, we can only kind of speculate, but let me point one thing out to you. In verse 4, and this is a sad reality a lot of times, not just in relationships where somebody is lying on one side, but any relationship where this is the case. Verse 4, it says that it happened that he loved a woman named Delilah. What does it not say? It does not say that the woman named Delilah loved him. It'll say that she used him, but it doesn't say that. It just says that he loved her. He fell in love with her. But sometimes that can be very much one-sided. In the next verse here, verse 6, it says, So Delilah said to Samson, Please tell me where your great strength lies. Exactly what the Philistines had asked her to do. And with what you may be bound to afflict you. Okay, she's not a great liar because she comes right out and she says, I'm wanting to do this for this reason. Okay, so she tells him, or she asks him this question, where does your strength lie? Now we know the answer to that. She didn't know the answer to that at the time. So she has to try to get this information out of him. And Samson responds for his part with this story of binding him with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried. Then he will become weak like any other man. Is that the truth? It is not. So he's told a lie in response to her trying to manipulate him and end up having him afflicted by the Philistines. So the story goes on, and of course we know the story. At least I hope you know the story of Samson. If not, then go back and read it tonight. But the rest of the story continues on this way, right? So this is the first time. But then once Samson has told her this, in verse 9 she says, The Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he broke the bowstrings as a strand of yarn breaks when it touches fire, and so the secret of his strength was not known. And so immediately, he's able to regain strength, or he never lost it. And so it turns out not to be the truth. Well, that happens once here. It happens again, and then it happens a third time. And then finally, the fourth time, something changes. Well, what changes? We'll skip down real quick to verse 15. She said to him, How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength lies. And it came to pass, when she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him so that his soul was vexed, that he told her all his heart and said to her, No razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. And if I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak like any other man. Verse 18, when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines. It took 4 tries, but eventually Delilah wears him down enough that he reveals everything. And in this moment of intimacy between the two of them, and Delilah finally getting the truth from him, what does she do? She reverts back to what she'd always wanted from day one, which was to sell him in order that they could torture him and eventually kill him. That's as far in the story as we're going to look. And of course, hopefully you know how that story finishes out, but we'll bring that up as we go along here too. But what I want to do with the rest of the time, and we'll keep tying back into this story as we do so, I want to make several applications when it comes to this kind of person. So again, we don't bring this up as theory, unfortunately, because we know people that this is true for. We know people, maybe in our business lives especially, this will happen, where somebody takes advantage of you. Hopefully not 4 times in a row, but where somebody has lied to you in order for them to gain, but at your expense. That happens. It happens a lot. It happens, unfortunately, in families all the time. And so we're not immune to this. So either you know someone, you are the someone, or you are maybe distantly connected, but you know of somebody like this. That's why we bring this up in the first place. So what is going to be true for these liars? That's kind of an ironic statement. But what will be true for people very much like Delilah that are consistently caught up in lies? And whether we call them from the psychological perspective compulsive liars or pathological liars, from the biblical perspective, we just say that they are caught up in the sin of lying. They follow after the pattern of Satan as a consistent liar. So what will liars do? Number one, liars will go as far as they can get away with. Every time. What do we see with Delilah here? Delilah pushes Samson 3 times in a row to being assaulted by the Philistines, or she at least announces that that's what's going to happen. She has him convinced, somehow though, after each time that this takes place, that she never really meant him any harm, even though she did exactly what he told her to do for him to lose his strength so that he could be afflicted. Every time she wins him back over, but she pushes him right to the limit, and then when it doesn't work out, she says, oh, okay, I'm sorry. I didn't really mean for that to happen, and that won't happen again, and next time it'll be different, and then the next time it's exactly the same thing. She goes right back to manipulating. Actually, she never stops. She just changes what she's trying to manipulate. The second thing is that liars will blame other people. Liars will blame you if you're the one that's interacting with them. Go back to verse 10 in the text, which we kind of skipped over. It says, Then Delilah said to Samson, Look, you've mocked me and told me lies. Now please tell me what you may be bound with. So, while we said it is true that Samson is lying, at the same time, she is calling him out for lying as if she hasn't been doing that. She's calling him out for mocking as if that's not her behavior. And so very often those who lie will try to flip things around, and they'll accuse you of doing what they are in fact doing. Or it may not be you. Sometimes you talk about this in a family situation. It may be that they blame the family instead. They extend that out and say, oh, well, your siblings never really liked me in the first place, or something along those lines. Now with this, the other tactic that will always follow here is that they prey on emotions. In verse 15, that's what Delilah does exactly. She says, How can you say you love, or I love you, when your heart is not with me? And so, you may have even heard that line before, but basically, well, if you loved me, if you really loved me, you would do this. If you really cared, you would do this. Well, that unfortunately worked for Delilah, but that doesn't mean that that's what love looks like. And of course, you compare that with the image of love that we see in 1 Corinthians 13 or 1 John chapter 4, and you say, that's not love. Love is very different than that. Love doesn't work in that kind of way. The third thing is that liars will tell you liars will tell you what you want to believe. So one reality of belief is that it's always easier to believe something that you want to believe rather than what's difficult to accept. And so people like Delilah will prey on that, the fact that you want to believe, even if it's not something that is true. And when it comes to people in this situation, it's really a presentation of how they see themselves. And so it's their reality versus actual reality. And so if reality doesn't conform to what they want you to see of them, then they have to lie to work their way around that. And that will happen. And then what eventually happens, and the intention is that over time, if they tell you the lie enough times, and you know this to be true in life in general, if the media tells you a lie enough times and they say it loud enough, eventually you'll believe it. And that's how it works here too. In Delilah's case, verse 16, it's probably the saddest verse in the text. It says, when she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him so that his soul was vexed to death. Now what's the irony there? He may have thought that it was to death, that it was just too difficult to bear, and yet it ends up being the very thing that kills him. And so liars will continue to lie until you start to believe it. And of course, for those being lied to, for the Samsons of the world, you can never believe it. Once you give in to that reality and accept it over true reality, you've already lost. Another point to be made here is that liars and narcissists, people who manipulate in general, they do not accept blame. The problem is, like with Delilah here, they don't accept blame. They don't even accept it when they're caught doing it. 3 times in a row, right? Delilah gets caught 3 times. She's caught perfectly red-handed doing the thing that Samson just told her would take his strength. And every time she somehow gets out of it. I don't know if it's just his love blinding him here or if it's her ability to manipulate, but the lies continue even afterwards. And so there's always going to be this sort of compulsion to cover up whatever it is because you have to keep up appearances. The next thing to say is that liars, very much like Satan, the comparison here, liars do not stop lying. What if Samson had not told her the truth that 4th time? What would Delilah have done? What if it hadn't worked out for her the 5th time? What would Delilah have done? What if it was the 6th and the 10th and the 20th time? What was she going to do? Every time she would do the exact same thing to try to get the result that she wanted. And that's what we're saying that liars will continually do. That's the danger. Verse 19, this is literal, but it's certainly true figuratively as well. It says, then she lulled him to sleep on her knee and called for a man to have him shave off the 7 locks of his head. And then she began to torment him, and his strength had left him. She lulled him to sleep after so many years, even at this point, potentially, of saying the same lies again and again, telling you that their behavior isn't bad, it's your behavior that's the problem. And eventually, you end up dead. But the bigger problem here may be in applying this to ourselves is that sometimes when people in our lives lie to us, we don't end up dead in the next year. But that doesn't have to be the case, right? Life can get a lot worse in a lot of ways before you die. It could end up as financial ruin. It could end up as abuse, probably most of the time, whether verbal or physical or any other. It can end up with broken homes. It can end up with jail. It can end up with drug abuse. It can end up with any number of things. But it all started with the lying, with the manipulation, and that's how it starts for Samson, but of course it ends up much worse for him. Now real quick on the practical side of this, because we want to keep this practical as well, I guess this is advice to Samson, but it's advice to anyone who's in his situation. So what do you do if you find yourself with Delilah? How do you respond to that? Well, whether spiritually or in today's secular kind of counseling that goes on, one of the first steps, well, the first step is going to be admitting the problem, but one of the first steps in solving it is going to be counseling. And again, that can mean that you're talking with elders in the church and with preachers, and both. That can mean that you're also talking to people in the community, people who are trained to deal with some of these kind of things. And of course, ideally, if you're Samson, you seek out counseling, right? But ultimately, you want Delilah to get counseling. What's the problem? Delilah will never accept counseling. Delilah will always resist counseling because it does two things. One, it doesn't keep up appearances. It kind of looks bad to go to counseling. And two, it accepts blame. It accepts that maybe I have some responsibility in the problem that's ongoing. So I will always resist counseling if I'm a liar. The next thing we would say is for Samson to educate himself. What does that mean? Well, that means scripturally, you want to have the absolute foundation of the Word of God when it comes to lying. Because you need to be able to compare your perceived reality that's going on with this person that's feeding you a reality versus what God's Word says is true. That may be the most important, but the other part of that is you have to know reality in this world also. And so education becomes a big part of this. And really that could just mean reading books on the subject, of which there are many, and there are many for any issue going on beyond just lying. But this kind of education hopefully can change the way that we respond, the way that we handle things, but also, of course, we're talking about this for 25 minutes, 30 minutes tonight. That's not enough to cover this topic or any topic in depth. So this is just a primer, an introduction on this. A third thing, and this one's challenging, and we don't know what Samson did here, but it is recommended most of the time for Samson to call out Delilah on the behavior. Now, that can create problems, especially if there's already a cycle of abuse, especially if there's anything else going on. But the reason for calling out is not to debate, because that's the problem, right? If Samson says, "Hey, Delilah, you're lying," is she going to accept that? Never. But that's not the reason. The reason is because if somebody's lying, then what you have to do is to let them know that you know the truth. Even if they deny it, even if they will never accept it, every time you say, I know you don't want to hear this, I know you can't accept it, but I know you're lying. And that can make a change in the person. It's for their benefit, not for our own. And the last thing we would say with that is to get support. Because again, if you're being lied to all the time, especially in a close relationship, the only thing that you can do is get people around you that believe you, that know the truth, that know the reality of the Word of God, because they can keep you stable in an otherwise unstable world. One last thing I'll say, as far as what Samson can do or what someone in that situation can do, and this, I'll extend that. If you're in any relationship, whether that's spousal, whether that's a friendship, whether that's anything else, what we cannot settle for is comparing the other person with people around them. Because there's such a temptation when we start to do that to say, well, they've got this issue and they lie all the time and they try to cover things up and they manipulate. And I know that, but at least they're not doing blank, whatever it may be. At least they're not like this person that I know that this happened to. Okay, sure, but is that really the standard that we measure other people with? Or do we say, maybe I need to get out of this toxic friendship because I'm comparing this person with what Christ would do? Is this person like Christ? Are they leading me closer to Christ? Or the opposite? And especially the closer that relationship is to you, the more worth that comparison is to say, I don't care if they are not as bad as this. I care if they're coming closer to this. Not that any of us can attain it, but if they never get any closer and they drag you farther away from Christ, it's not going to work out very well. Okay, so the last thing, we're about to close out here. The last thing we'll say about Samson and Delilah is this. We aren't told the rest of her story. We don't really know what happened to her after this. We can presume that she got paid because she did exactly what was asked of her. So she probably got that $100,000 or however much it was. So good for her, right? She become a black widow after that. If you know what I'm talking about. She go on a long string of manipulating other people and getting payoffs from the Philistines or whoever. I don't know. But she probably didn't change much after that. But here's the thing. We might not know her fate, but whose fate do we know? We know the victim's fate. We know that he spent the rest of his short life after this in prison, being tortured, having his eyes gouged out, and ultimately killing himself in an attempt to get revenge on the enemies of God. That's the fate of the person that didn't make a change, that chose to stay in the same position, recognizing potential danger and never doing anything about it. Again, sometimes, like we said, lies are not that consequential here. Sometimes you tell somebody that you like the lemon pie, even when it's not good. But then sometimes people end up dead as a result. And usually it's the people that never made a change in the first place. And so maybe the start of tonight's invitation is this: be careful who is in your life. Isn't that worth considering? Even though Christ went and ate with sinners and tax collectors, his group were the people that he chose to be around him. And the same thing needs to be true for us as well, that we choose people who are going to make us more like Christ and get away from the people that make us less like Christ. And of course, a whole class of those people we've talked about tonight. Tonight, the other side of the invitation is this: that there is one person who will lie to you every time that you hear from him. The person who has lied from the beginning, the person who has inspired every other liar that has ever been. Satan wants nothing more than to lie to you, to make you comfortable enough to believe what sounds good, to believe what you want to believe, which is that maybe you don't have to be that great. Maybe you really don't have to be that focused on God for things to work out for you. Or maybe you can just live like the rest of the world and things will work out. But that's always been a lie, and it continues to be one. Tonight, instead, draw close to God, and Satan will flee from you. Humble yourself before God, and he will lift you up. This evening, if there's anything that you need as far as coming closer to God, to become a child of his, we'd love to talk to you about that. Tonight, though, if you need to come back to Christ, if you strayed away from him, or if you need help from the church in any other way, we ask that you come now as we stand, as we sing.